This show is sponsored by Realtor Cynthia Baer, Putting Down Roots. Visit your in-town real estate specialist in Atlanta at cynthiabaer.com.
You are now tuned in to the Good Gracious Show. Welcome.
Howdy, Good Gracious family. It is Halloween, October 31st, Thursday, 2019. Boyd Baker here, your Good Gracious podcast host. Hope you're doing well. South is a little wet right now. It's going to get a little chilly this weekend, but we have our famous local chili cook-off going on, so it's all going to be good. I just wanted to say that this episode really focuses more on the change makers. I had the opportunity to sit down with a local politician and activist, Nguyen, and she replaced Stacey Abrams in our state House of Representatives. A lot of people don't realize how the government all is structured, but she is doing amazing work and just a great advocate for everybody in the state of Georgia, I believe. So I felt it was important. We wanted to talk a little bit about fair fight, and I didn't really know what that was all about. I'd heard Stacey Abrams started this, but I didn't know what it meant. So this is just a wonderful opportunity. So just sit back or plug in your earbuds and enjoy.
My name is Nguyen, and I am the state representative for House District 89, which includes City of Atlanta and DeKalb County, and it is the seat that Stacey Abrams held before she stepped up to run for governor.
So that's a nice little, those are big shoes to fill these days, right?
They're huge shoes to fill, but I found out it gives me a little bit of credibility because every time I tell somebody I'm a state rep, their eyes kind of glaze over. And then when I go, well, I filled Stacey Abrams' seat, she's my neighbor, then people get more interested.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I always say, thanks for the street cred, Stacey.
Yeah. And what made you want to run for office?
Well, I never thought that I was going to run for office, and I never was interested in running because I come from a family that didn't really participate politically. So my parents are refugees from Vietnam that came over in '79, and before they came over, my dad was held a prisoner of war in his country for 3 years, and when he was released, my family made the decision to leave their country in the middle of the night on a little boat, and a Thai fisherman found them in the middle of the sea and saved their lives, and we don't even know his name or who he is or whatever happened to him. But he was the person who gave my parents and 30 members of my family a second chance at life. And so when they were resettled in America, which was in '79, they were resettled under President Jimmy Carter. And he had made the decision to double the number of Vietnamese refugees from 5,000 to 10,000 people, which was very politically unpopular at the time. Only 37% of Americans supported the resettling of Vietnamese refugees. And the Republican governor of Iowa happened to be one of those people who supported the resettlement of refugees because he saw footage of Vietnamese refugees, their boats being pushed back into the sea. And so I was born in Ames, Iowa, and then my family moved down to the South when I was a little girl in second grade. And growing up, they taught me the typical things that immigrant families teach their children, which is study really hard, make good grades, and you can only be one of three things in life. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, and my parents had this caveat that at the very worst, I could be a pharmacist or an engineer. Yes. Yeah.
Those are your plan B.
Yeah, that was my plan B, like in a worst case scenario. Yeah. But I was an English major, and I got my bachelor and master's in English. Well. Yes, it did not make any sense to them. And then I went on to start a nonprofit working with young women in public high schools. The reason I did that is because as I was growing up, I saw that my parents were disempowered. They did not feel like they had a voice at the table, and they were afraid to have a voice because they came from a government that did not allow them to have one. And so they were very afraid for us to participate in any way, politically or civically. They wanted us to keep our heads down, make good grades, and stay out of trouble. I wasn't like that because, growing up, if you watch the two people that you love the most not feel like they're empowered, it changes the way in which you view the world. And so I decided I wanted to work with young women, and many of them happen to be immigrants or children of immigrants. And they look like me, and they come from households in which their parents struggled to learn a new language. They were working 2 or 3 jobs and just didn't know how to give their daughters the emotional tools, the emotional resources that young women need to be successful. So I ended up working in public high schools in Atlanta and DeKalb for 10 years in the classroom with young women who just need a safe space and who just need to feel like somebody really understands what they're going through, and give them that extra boost of confidence so that they can finish school and go on to either college or a trade or to get a job, but essentially to be economically independent and contributors to society. And so as I was doing that work, I started to recognize all the ways in which policy impacts the way that we fund schools, the way that we view public schools, the way that we handle things like sexual assault, physical abuse, domestic violence, all these things that are prevalent in the households and communities of these young women. And we weren't talking about them in any meaningful kind of way at school and not in the community. And then the understanding that I was working with 75 girls a year, and there are just thousands of other girls in Georgia who need that same type of support. So I started advocating and working on a bill to clear the backlog of rape kits, which in 2015, I was down at the Capitol with sexual assault survivors, and many of them had never met their reps or senators or talked to their elected officials. And in doing that work, I recognize that the Capitol, though it is a space designed for the people, it does not feel like it's for the people. I didn't feel like I belonged there, and both sides look exactly the same, so it's very confusing. And almost all the electeds look exactly the same, too.
There's a lot of that.
So that was also very confusing. And I remember distinctly being in the hallway talking to a senator about why it's important to get a rape kit tested. And I was standing next to sexual assault survivors, and I thought, we shouldn't even be in the position where we have to ask somebody to test DNA to take rapists off the street, and this needs to change. And that was the first time I actually felt like I belonged at the Capitol in any way. And so when Stacey stepped up to run for governor, it was the opportunity for me to run, but then I also face the thing that women face, which is we need to be told 5 to 7 times on average that we should run for office. But for me, it was a lot more. Yeah.
But you did.
I did it.
Yeah.
I did it. Yeah.
How's it been? How's that experience been compared to what you thought it would be like?
You know, it has been incredibly immersive and just emotionally taxing in a lot of ways.
Well, there's so much going on.
There's so
at
much
any
going
given
on.
moment.
Yes, there's so much going on. And you start to recognize that this is really a system that's designed to work for a very few number of people. So even in our legislative body, we have 236 people at the General Assembly. We have 180 people on the House and 56 people on the Senate. There are very few people that are under the age of 40. I'm the only Asian woman out of 236 elected officials. I'm the only daughter of refugees. And even things like diversity in careers, there aren't that many people who work in public schools who have been in the nonprofit sector. And so you see how all of these pieces come together and really allow me to have a little bit of a different perspective. For instance, because I work with young women who are undocumented, I've watched for the last decade how our immigration policies impact them. So I understand the fear of police in the community. I understand the barriers to higher education. I understand the fear in which most families live because of our immigration policies. And so I very quickly became a leader in the legislature for tackling some of the anti-immigrant policies that came down the pipeline. And as I was sitting in these committee meetings, people were like, "Are you an immigration attorney?" And I said, no, I just happen to work with real people.
Yeah. I just know a lot about the real issues that are going on.
Right. And that makes a huge difference because that's what you're grounded in and that's what you're rooted in. And, I think we always say representation matters. And I think that we all believe and understand why that is an important concept. But when you see it play out in real time, you think it really, really matters. Another example is when I started doing advocacy, I was sitting in a Ways and Means Committee meeting, which is where all of the taxation bills originate from. And they were debating a tax exemption for yacht repairs of $500,000. And the lawmakers sitting at the tables said, well, how is this going to affect my houseboat? How will this affect my 2 jet skis? And I thought, oh my God, this is how rich people maintain their wealth. They are sitting at the right table and they are making policies to protect their assets. And I was blown away by just how incredibly deliberate the system is in allowing people to protect the wealthiest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So how did or was it just a natural extension, Fair Fight come into your life or your engagement?
Well, Fair Fight came into my life because in 2018, when Stacey was running for governor, I organized using my house as a field location in our district, and we knocked on over 30,000 doors for Stacey, and I was very immersed in her campaign. And as we were doing this work, then the Democratic Party of Georgia also developed a voter protection hotline. And working closely with DPG and DeKalb and Stacey Abrams' campaign, we started hearing stories of massive voter suppression through some of the policies that we have passed at the state level, but also from a lack of uniformity on how we handle voting in general. And so the reports we got were anything from the massive voter purges off of the voter rolls, 500,000 Georgians being purged, and people not even getting notice that they were purged and not even knowing that they were no longer considered an active voter. People whose absentee ballots were rejected. We had a unprecedented number of absentee ballots that were rejected. We had absentee ballots that were lost altogether. We had absentee ballots that were rejected because of an exact signature match. We had voters whose voter registrations were frozen because of the exact name match. And so we saw all these instances in which the voters in Georgia were unable to cast their ballots. And even on election day, my team and I visited voting precincts throughout the district and across to City of Atlanta, Fulton, where there were long lines because there weren't enough voting machines or voting machines were broken. And we handed umbrellas out, we ordered pizza for people, did anything that we could to keep people in line. And the reality is it should not be that hard to vote. And there were so many flaws that came out of the 2018 election that showed us that we have so much to fix with our electoral system, and that what's happening in Georgia is not reflective of the democracy that people deserve. When you talk about these, absentee ballots or suppression rules that go through, or the other challenges, is there any sense of what that number of individuals are, or what percentage that represents in the state? It can be kind of vague and hard, but I think it's really hard for people who hear this, who don't believe there's anything wrong. Right. Because they don't see it, maybe, in their polling district or whatever the issues are. Right. But how can people wrap their head around how large a number that could be? You know what I'm saying? So, for example, with the exact match, the exact match is a policy that came out of the General Assembly in 2016. And I actually remember Stacey Abrams speaking in the well against this bill. And I distinctly remember her saying, this bill is going to suppress votes and it will impact voters of color the most, because this policy says if you register to vote, all the information on your voter registration must exactly match any information from Department of Driver Services or Social Security Administration, including apostrophes, any kind of typos. There's no process for screening, just clerical errors. And so what our state did that is different from other states is instead of simply allowing a voter to show an ID at the poll, as they do anyway, to fix that, they just freeze the voter registration and say, we are not processing this as an active voter. And that it is incumbent upon the person who registered to go and fix that through elections boards, which most people don't know how to do. And who has time for that? People work, they have families, they have transportation issues. It's hard to do things like that.
Well, and you may not know.
Right. Language
until you
barriers
get there,
too.
until
Right.
you get to vote and you need to go fix it.
And it's
But
too late.
It's too late.
So that affected 53,000 people in Georgia who registered to vote in 2018. And it affected, of those 53,000, 70% were African American. And of those 53,000, 80% were African American, Asian, or Latino. So that's an example of just how one policy impacted the voters in Georgia. A second example is upon the after the 2018 election, we learned that there were many people who were rejected at the polls on voting day, and they were forced to use a provisional ballot to cast their vote instead. With a provisional ballot, the responsibility is upon the voter to go back and do what we call cure or fix whatever mistake was that didn't allow them to vote in the first place. I went to our DeKalb County Elections Board, and I picked up 247 pages of voters who had to vote provisionally. And those pages probably have like 20 lines for people to fill in. And I looked through every single one of those pages, and the way in which we capture the information is not uniform. Some of it's not legible, and there's no information by which you can contact the voter. So no address or no phone number. In the aftermath, we organized with the Democratic Party of Georgia to go literally physically knock door by door and say, did you fix your ballot yet? Do you know you have to go fix your ballot? You have to fix your ballot or your vote is not going to count. I was in South DeKalb knocking doors, and the majority of voters that I talked to didn't even know that they had to go fix their ballots.
They thought that they just done a provisional and that's going to cover it.
And that was going to cover it. And so we know with certainty that votes were not counted. And so, you know, there are so many fixes that need to be made and can be made, but there's not the political will to make those fixes at this point in time.
So what would be, would it be just through the general legislature, or is it through, who would have the best chance of saying, here are the 5 issues we have,
right?
You know, and let's just take care of this and be done with it and move on.
So when we came into the legislative session this year in 2019, voting rights were among the top issue. We just saw exactly how flawed our election systems were, and we had an unprecedented number of people turn out to vote in 2018. So the best and most effective way to fix these things are through the Georgia General Assembly, along with the support of our Secretary of State. And we spent the session debating a large voting bill, House Bill 316, which encompassed a number of these things that we're talking about now. Primarily, one, replacing the insecure voting machines. So we have been using these voting machines that are old and recently ruled to be dangerous to our election systems by federal judge Amy Totenberg. So we can no longer use those because of the election's insecurity. However, instead of replacing our voting machines with more electronic machines, we were asking for a system where we could have hand-marked paper ballots because they are more secure and they are more verifiable. We were unable to pass legislation to do that. There was no will, and it was a very partisan issue. In that same voting bill, House Bill 316, there were provisions that had to do with purging our voter rolls. So we extended the time by which we purge, but in reality, we should not purge in general. There's no sense in purging you can clean up a voter roll, but purging voters off the roll for what we call inactive is another form of suppression. And
how do you clean it? How do you clean that roll?
I mean,
which is kind of
right,
purging. If people are you saying like they're deceased and they're
exactly
still on those kinds
they're
of issues.
deceased, they've moved,
right,
they're registered under what we would know to be a fake name like Scooby-Doo, like joke registrations, those names. But for people who register to vote and they miss a few election cycles, they should not be purged.
Yeah, they can choose to vote or not to vote.
Exactly.
Right?
It's your fundamental right to exercise when you want to exercise it. And it hasn't even been implemented properly. For instance, I was just looking at some of the information for our voters in District 89, and there were people who voted in this last election cycle who are currently labeled inactive. And so I have told our constituents, wherever I am, check your voter registration. Make sure it is up to date because we don't know what the heck is going on. So in this bill, we also had provisions to change some of the things that we saw, but they were all small changes that resulted out of lawsuits. So, for example, we saw that in Gwinnett County, they sued on the exact signature match, and they won that lawsuit. And that is really...
That it was okay, that it was legal to have that...
Well, Gwinnett lost. We won the lawsuit.
Oh, okay.
Gwinnett lost. Yeah. Opposite way. Yeah. So Gwinnett County lost that lawsuit for the signature match. And we saw a number of other lawsuits come out of 2018 in which I think that we as voters won on, I believe, almost every single one of those lawsuits because the way in which the counties were handling these elections was just inconsistent and unconstitutional. But one of the provisions in which I worked on personally was the exact match. So I remember distinctly Stacey Abrams speaking against this bill in 2016, and what she said, this is going to disproportionately impact voters of color, is exactly what happened. And one of the reasons I was poised to be able to work on this bill so effectively is because when I got elected in 2017, the General Assembly misspelled my last name 3 times on their state website in 3 different ways. So my last name, Nguyen. It's very, very common for people to invert the G and the Y. It's just the way that our brains are trained. If you are raised to speak English as your main language and you're not used to seeing a last name such as mine, it's very easy for your brain to just invert it and never notice it. And it's the perfect example of why our laws cannot be made based on human error. It cannot be made based on somebody entering in a name into a system because it leaves way for a lot of error. And so my last name was misspelled 3 different times in 3 different ways on our state website. One time they put an R at the end of my last name. So I said, you could call me Representative Winter. That's fine. If you want to keep that one. And during my legislative session, every time I got a committee meeting notice, my last name was also misspelled. So I started saving all of these instances, and I worked with the Lawyers Committee, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and the ACLU before we came into session to draft a bill to gut this exact match legislation. And when we got in, I was calculating, should I drop this? When should I do this? How should I do this? And it's one of those unspoken rules. If you are a freshman lawmaker, if you speak up against Republican bills, if you ask questions in committee, if you're just not going to go along to get along, you are not going to get any bills passed. So I already knew I'm not going to get this bill passed under my name, but perhaps there's another way to move this along. I had pulled with the support of Fair Fight and a couple of orgs the exact number of people whose voter registrations were frozen by district. And when I looked at it, it was disproportionately Democratic districts, disproportionately counties with huge minority populations. But every single lawmaker had a number of ballots that were not processed because of this exact match legislation. So I was able to show that to both sides of the aisle. Look, your constituents are also being impacted by this. But we have these things called amendments that you can drop in committee hearings. And at one point during session, I thought, you know what? I'm going to take my entire bill and I'm going to turn it into an amendment and see if I can amend this big House Bill 316 voting bill. And so I sat in subcommittee because with our governmental affairs, you can only offer amendments in subcommittee. I wasn't part of the subcommittee, but I wanted to hear everything that was happening in subcommittee, and I signed up to testify. And so I sat in subcommittee for 3 days. It was 11 hours of public testimony, overwhelmingly people who did not support this bill because it still contains major flaws and didn't fix all these voter suppression issues that we've been seeing. And on the last day, chairman said, all right, we're done with testimony. And I said, wait, what about me? I've been sitting here for the past 3 days. And he said, all right, do you still want to testify? Well, yeah, I want to testify. And I think he's a little afraid of my name. So he doesn't ever call me Representative Nguyen. Yeah. And I in fact, he probably just didn't even want to call my name because he couldn't pronounce it. So I think he said something like, okay, sweetheart, you can testify tomorrow morning on the last day of our subcommittee. So I said, all right. So I go before my colleagues the next morning, and I had brought in all these committee meeting notices in which my last name was misspelled. And I said, look, we just cannot have a policy that is predicated on human error. Look at all these committee meeting notices in which my last name is misspelled. But the added bonus is on everybody's desk. There was a folder that listed the names of the full governmental affairs committee meeting members. And in that folder, my last name was misspelled, but so was Representative Renita Shannon's. And so I said, and if you take a look at the folder in front of you and you look at the names of our committee meeting members, you'll see that Representative Renita Shannon's name is misspelled and my name is misspelled. And she happens to be Black and I happen to be Asian. And so it put them on the spot in terms of really having the evidence of like why this law just does not work. And the chairman of the subcommittee accepted a portion of my amendment. He said, I will accept this portion of your amendment. And so after we left subcommittee, I looked at the portion in which he accepted, and I thought, I don't know that he clearly understands that if he accepted this portion, then he is in fact gutting almost all of this because it triggered a series of things. And so I thought, what do I do next? Should I assume he knew? Should I just let this go? And then when it's implemented into law, then it's interpreted in a certain way or whatever. So it's like, you know what? I'm just going to go to his office. And this chairman and I in committee have butted heads a few times. And I showed up to his office, and he was incredibly different in the privacy of his office and much more willing to talk. And I said, hey, Chairman, I don't know if you realize this, but if you accept this provision, then it changes all of these other things in this legislation. And so all of these things would have to change. And he said, okay, well, let me pull in legal counsel. And he pulled in legal counsel, and legal counsel agreed with me. So when we went back into full committee, they changed the portions in which he accepted and struck out almost all of that exact match voter suppression legislation. And so now, if you have an inexact match on your registration versus your driver's license or your social security information, instead of being frozen, your process is active. And then you go to the polls and you just show your ID. So we were able to fix that one small thing through a series of maneuvers.
Yeah.
And I think that is what the legislative, that's the side of the legislature that I don't think the public understands is It's a constant maneuvering and constant adapting and constant relationship building and taking risks and being strategic and being determined and committed and thoughtful. And so for almost an entire year, I was working on this one thing, and it happened to pass through a different mechanism than what we would typically envision, like through the how a bill becomes a law.
Right.
Yeah.
In the elementary way.
Yeah.
Like it.
Yeah.
Well, but so now, if I'm correct in what you said, then some of the issues that are still there about voter suppression, it becomes a much longer game.
Yes.
And you've either got to take them one at a time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are a number of ways in which we can move forward. So Fair Fight was created after the 2018 elections, and the goal is to provide fair and secure elections. I mean, period, right? So for anyone, for everybody
So
in Georgia.
is it an advocacy group to kind of deal with the General Assembly, or, I mean, are there actual boots on the ground things that can be done by Fair Fight?
So there are a number of initiatives. So, for example, Fair Fight created a fellowship arm. So I'm a senior fellow with Fair Fight, and it's a 6-month program in which lawmakers are coming in every month, and they are equipping us with the tools and resources to go back in 2020 and be effective in our roles. So that's one arm of Fair Fight. But they are also doing advocacy work, and they they're nationwide now. So Stacy is doing work in every state to ensure these free and fair elections. And yes, there are ways to get involved as a volunteer. I mean, boots on the ground and organizing are among one of the most important things that we can do as citizens, right? It's the sharing of information, of going door to door, of talking to your neighbor, of telling them these are really critical issues, and this is why we need to change leadership in Georgia, because until we change the political structure, it's going to be really hard for us to change these laws. The exact match only happened by a fluke in some ways, but also it's unlikely. That's just not how the process works at the General Assembly. And so it requires us as a general public to change the electorate. And when we change the electorate, we can change those laws. But at the same time, it requires us as a public to make sure people know that these laws are, in fact, suppressing votes. And so it's a combination of advocacy, and it's also using our judicial process. I have never liked lawyers more, like in this moment in my life.
We like them when they help us, for sure.
I know.
You know?
I suddenly
They can
have
be a useful
regrets
tool.
about not becoming a
Yeah,
lawyer. I'm
your
like, I should have
parents are-
listened to my parents. Why didn't I go to law school? You'd be suing for these things.
Yeah.
But we have seen that system of checks and balances be incredibly important under this particular administration at the federal and state level. For example, when we passed the 6-week abortion ban, which was clearly unconstitutional, we had to lean on the court system to grant the injunction, which was just granted this week. So, yes, I have appreciation for lawyers in the judicial system more than I ever have before in my life.
Well, so what are the, so let's just say we've got the exact match, at least in our state, is somewhat resolved.
Right.
But what can be done before the next election, really? Is there anything that can be done, or is it still all has to go through House?
There are a lot of things that can be done. So this is not ideal, but it is necessary, and it is the next step because we were unable to pass anything legislatively at the state level. The county elections boards have the authority to make certain changes and to prepare in a different way. So, for instance, right now with DeKalb County Elections Board, the DeKalb Board of Commissioners have requested an audit of the 2018 elections. That way we can see exactly where everything went wrong. Why did we have to use 250 pages of provisional ballots? And why were the lines so long at certain precincts? Where do we need to make sure staff are better trained so that people know they have to go back and fix their ballots? Where do we need to put extra voting machines? All of those types of things. The county has the ability to do that. What's happening right now is that the county, the elections board has been resistant to an audit for the reasons I'm unsure. I'm unsure of what those reasons might be. But there's resistance to conducting that full audit that would allow us to better see what happened in our county at least. And that would give them a footprint for how they can make changes so that in 2020, we are better equipped to handle our elections. So I would say there needs to be some public pressure that is directed towards our county elections boards and asking them to work in tandem with us to make those changes.
To work with Fair Fight or to work with the legislature? I mean, who's doing the audit?
So it would be to work with the Board of Commissioners, and it would be to work with the citizens of DeKalb County. And Fair Fight's role is really to equip people to be that advocacy arm. So Fair Fight wouldn't be involved necessarily in an elections audit, but certainly in organizing people to share their election stories, to understand that they have agency as it pertains to asking the elections board to do an audit, and making sure we amplify the issue so that the Board of Commissioners continues to put that pressure on the Board of Elections.
So what's the deadline? Let's be honest about this. So what's the deadline if you were going to do that audit? I mean, TikTok.
I know, it should really happen now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, how long would it take to do the audit? Would it be finished in time to have any sense of 2020?
I'm unsure of that. I would...
Not that you shouldn't do the work. I'm not suggesting that we go, well, you can't get done, so you shouldn't do it. But
right.
A lot of people do face it. They go, well, it won't change this election, but it'll change the next one. So if you can get it done.
Well, for example, one simple thing that I believe the DeKalb board could do, and maybe this is contingent on getting federal approval, and I don't know what that process looks like. But when I picked up the provisional ballot forms, it just has a slot for your name, and there's a code that is linked back to like why you weren't able to vote with a ballot that day. So it could be a mismatch or ID or something.
Right.
So there's a code. And so all you have is the person's name. So if you went in, I would have Boyd Baker's name and the reason why you weren't able to vote. And that's all I have. So for campaigns for the Democratic Party, we would have to go and hunt you down somehow. There's no phone number, there's no address, anything. And so we use a system to look up your name, and maybe there are 12 of you. So we might not even be able to track you down. But maybe there are only 2 of you, and you can tell by which precinct you live in. And so then we know where you live and can come knock on your door and say, hey, you need to go back and fix this. Mm-hmm. So I simply said, can we not just add 2 lines with an address and a phone number? And that way, if we need to find voters, we can find them. And we can say, hey, you need to go back and fix your ballot, or it will not count. A simple fix like that makes sense to me, and I cannot understand why we would not do something like that.
So how was that received?
The answer I got was it would be contingent on federal law. And I said, well, what does that process look like? And I haven't really gotten an answer back. Meaning
the provisional ballots on a federal level are created this way, so they can't necessarily change it on the state level. Is that your assumption?
That was my assumption, that if you make changes with certain forms, that it has to go through a process that wouldn't violate like a federal voting act. Or yeah. So B, you need to be talking to Washington. Come on, what are you doing with all these hours you've been sleeping? I know, right?
Yeah. So that is a big ball of wax. And the benefit for people getting involved with Fair Fight is it's critical, one, to show that you have a massive support, but really it's when time is needed for people to speak up or organize or show up. Is that really kind of the goal?
Yeah, and it is organizing not just during election cycles, right? It is doing all the work in between. Preparing. And consistently, right? And because we have the tendency to do the work during elections and then everything kind of fizzles off. And so it's an apparatus by which we're consistently organizing. And in fact, Stacey Abrams has also started a second arm called Fair Count. And Fair Count is centered around census and helping people understand the importance of why we need to fill out a census form. I saw Stacey last night. She spoke at the Atlanta Young Dems, and she said 80% of the way in which we're conducting census now will be online. And then if you think about 80% of it being filled out online, and you go down to South Georgia,
where there's no internet
there's
service.
no internet.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens to all the people who don't have broadband? Right. I was in South Georgia and Randolph County last year when there were 7 precincts scheduled to close, and I went door to door knocking on voters' doors because there is a provision that says if more than 20% of registered voters in this precinct sign a petition and say we don't want our voting precinct to close, then you can override the decision of the elections board. So I'm going door to door in Randolph County, no cell phone service. And so in my car, I had T-Mobile. Another one of the passengers had T-Mobile, and one person had Verizon. So Verizon would get half, like 1 bar at some point. And so every time the Verizon rider got a bar, we were like, stop, download all this information, figure out where we're going, because we don't know where we're going. Yeah. And so you think about, these ways in which people deliberately make system changes to leave people out. And we know that something like that is going to result in an undercount. And so besides fair fight, there's fair count. And really this idea that you don't have to be in a position of elected office to make change. And Stacey is leading the charge for that. She's saying, look, I didn't win the governor's race, but what we did in this governor's race was we built this apparatus, we built this energy, we built this momentum, and I'm not going away. We're going to continue to build on that. We organize people. And what I really love about Stacey, besides all the obvious things, is she built this team around her of young people and people of color and women, and they have continued to be part of her team beyond her election. They're now the people who work at Fair Fight, the people who work at Fair Count, and they are young and energized, and those are the people, and I see them everywhere. In fact, when we had our Fair Fight Fellowship the other day, I saw all of them and I was like, it's like a family reunion because we saw each other during the election all the time. Right. And so you see that she is uplifting young leaders and she's building a bench. And that's also part of how we need to examine the ways in which we're building power in our state. And so that was, to me, that's such a good example of empowering people to continue to be part of a process and not just as a legislative aide or an intern, but really in leadership roles. Yeah.
Well, and you see, they have a rare opportunity to see the genesis of something, but also the long vision and what it's going to take. I mean, that's when you're creating an organization like that, you're really having to think about all the challenges that go into life. So besides Fair Fight, what is your focus then? I mean, with the legislature.
So I've been working on 2 pieces of legislation, and let me say this. So when I decide what to work on, these are the things that I think about. How likely is it to pass? Can we build bipartisan support around it? Is there a Republican who can carry this legislation for me? And is this a bill that is a statement bill that says, I want to put this issue on the table? Or is this a bill that I believe that we can pass under our current political leadership? And so last year, I came into session with 3 bills. One was the exact match bill. And that was actually my ideology bill. I was like, this is not going to pass, but we need to talk about it. It's an important issue. I'm going to drop this bill and we will talk about it. And then the other bill was a bill to close the loophole for temporary civil protective orders in violent intimate partner relationships in Georgia. If you are in an intimate relationship, and they categorize intimate as family violence. So it could be parent, child, brother, sister, husband, wife, partnership, any of those things. The exclusion that they make for a temporary civil protective order is if you are in a serious dating relationship and you're not married and you don't live in the same household and you don't have a child, you cannot grant a temporary civil protective order against the person who has threatened or abused you. And so this loophole...
Is there something else you can... I mean, we think of that in general as a restraining order, am I right?
Right. So the other alternative is you could file for a stalking order, but that is much more complicated because you have to show a series
you got to have your paperwork in line.
Yeah, there's got to be a trail of multiple instances in which you prove it is a pattern. So if you are in an instance in which, it was one time, you have to wait
until
right?
you have
that
more.
Makes no sense to me. There was a woman in Cobb County who was pregnant, but the baby wasn't born yet, and she was not married and didn't live with the person who is abusive towards her, and she was denied a protective order because she was pregnant. Right. So this is a big loophole that has existed in many states, but almost every state has closed it, except for, I believe it's 8 states who haven't closed it. And this issue came up like many years ago when I was doing advocacy work. I started looking at it and realized that we need to strengthen our temporary protective orders. And the conversation we've always had around that is, when can we do it? When's good timing? Because the fear that most advocacy groups and most people who do direct services is, if we put this issue on the table, is it going to open a can of worms in which they place further restrictions on this? So, for example, I said, what if we did a bill that required all public schools to do comprehensive sex ed? And they said, well, what if you introduced a bill like that? And then they had an idea that to do the opposite. And so there's always a calculation of when the timing is extremely important. And so we had been debating whether or not we should bring the temporary protective order bill up for a long time because we were concerned about people creating further restrictions. But I worked for an entire year with Partnership Against Domestic Violence and the Coalition and all these partners that are invested in domestic violence work, and we perfected the language. It went around to all the groups. There were several iterations, because one thing that I think is very important as a lawmaker is you do not want to write legislation that has unintended consequences when carried out. And the people who understand those unintended consequences are most often the people working on the ground. So we spent an entire year writing this piece of legislation, and there is a Republican chairwoman who has been very strong on domestic violence bills, and she has agreed to carry it. And she dropped it last year, and it got assigned to committee. And then she decided that she wanted to look at the criminal side as well. And so she withdrew it, and she's currently working on the criminal side. So I do believe that if she chooses to move forward with it, then it's legislation that we'll see become law. So I feel pretty good about that. We had a conversation recently about how we can strengthen it and some of the language around that, and also how if there's room to strengthen some of the stalking orders. And also part of the process, to me, is it has to be a little bit more immersive. So I spent a day in Fulton County Court in a courtroom where the judge just deals with TPOs all day. And just watch them. And it was really hard.
Oh, yeah.
It was very, very hard to see people that once were close be in the court feeling unsafe or asking for intervention from a legal standpoint. And I know it takes a lot to get to that point because we often don't want to hurt the people that we're close to, or we're scared or embarrassed or ashamed. And so I spent a day in court watching that, because one of the things that comes up sometimes is people say, oh, judges issue TPOs like candy, then anyone can get one. And that wasn't true. You do have to come you do have to prove it. Yeah. And there's a burden of proof for people. And so it was not like that at all. So working on that. And then the second major thing I'm working on is legislation on solitary confinement. So this kind of is a full circle thing for me. So I mentioned earlier my dad was imprisoned in his country for 3 years, and it was part of re-education camp where thousands of Vietnamese men and women were locked up for having an education or being affiliated with Americans. My dad was a lieutenant in the medical army for the South Vietnamese. And so he was locked up in this prison in a remote jungle for 3 years as a young man before he was even 30 years old. And he never talks about it. The few times in which he talked about it, the information that we have garnered as his daughters are that there was starvation involved in hard labor, and that's about all we know about it. So that's been a kind of a theme in my life, just what my parents endured, and the recognition that their trauma changed who they were, and when they came here, they never received any sort of mental health services. And so I think about that sometimes, just how being incarcerated affected my dad. But there was another layer in which I think it made it worse, is that he willingly turned himself in because the government said, it's just going to be a week or 2 weeks and you just learn about your new form of government. And he willingly turned himself in, and it turned into 3 years. And so as we have been watching our immigration policies change federally, and how it's resulted in just really cruel treatment of people who came here for a better life. I've come to see that in our state, we have 3 for-profit detention centers, and the use of solitary confinement in detention centers is excessive and without any kind of accountability. And in Georgia, there were a number of men who, all of them, I believe, were like in their 40s, who ended up committing suicide after a stint of solitary or while they were in solitary confinement. And I think of these men being locked up and nobody caring about them, and just really no accountability with the way in which we handle immigration, and no judicial process. But I understand that I'm limited as a state lawmaker. I can't make any changes by law that would impact federal immigration laws. And so I thought, I need to look at solitary confinement and what they're doing with our state prisons. And when I looked at our state prisons, I saw that in Georgia, there are almost no restrictions around solitary confinement, period. So we use it for juveniles, we use it for seniors, we use it for people with mental health issues, people with disabilities. And the way in which we use it is cruel and inhumane. And there are cases that have come out of our state prisons where people were held in solitary for years, and it's shown that it causes post-traumatic stress and that it can trigger mental health issues. And so there is a lawsuit right now that the Southern Center for Human Rights filed, and the lawsuit resulted in one policy change for Jackson State Prison. It now says if you are in solitary confinement for every 24 hours, you get 4 hours of daylight. Previously, it was an hour. And what I found out was Department of Corrections has only changed that policy for one prison, which does not make sense to me. I'm like, why not change the policy for all prisons? Why are we constantly changing policies and laws only out of lawsuits? That is just not the right way.
Because the lawsuit was about that prison, they just changed the policy there. Yeah,
exactly. So I have some Republican colleagues who have been really great on reforms to the criminal legal system. People who were in prison ministry. For example, one of the representatives that I am talking to about the solitary confinement bill has been visiting prisoners on death row and witnessed an execution this summer. He was trying to work with some folks to get a stay and ultimately were unsuccessful in that. So I'm working on restrictions to solitary confinement. I dropped a bill related to that last year. The bill will not go anywhere, but the secondary strategy piece is, can we at least change this the policy within DOC? And also, can we create a study committee by which we just examine solitary confinement as a whole in the state of Georgia and look at all these issues from the juvenile perspective, but also the adult population and how it impacts all of the vulnerable populations that I mentioned before. An example was, I did not even think about this, but I was on the call with our disability caucus, and I talked about the solitary confinement bill, and somebody said, thank you for working on that legislation, because when a deaf person is thrown in solitary, they emerge out of it with language deprivation because their senses are altered in a way that ours aren't. And so I hadn't even thought about it in those ways, right? But you know, that is something that needs to be fixed, and I don't think a lot of people know about it. And I think there are so many things that need to be fixed around the criminal legal system, the ways in which things are implemented beforehand and then while people are incarcerated and then after people are incarcerated. There's so much that we need to fix around it. I went to Sparta this summer and went to Hancock Prison, which is a high maximum facility prison. And I sat in on a philosophy class with men who are incarcerated for life or for life without parole. And many of them have committed serious crimes. And we discussed in this class whether or not you could be liberated behind bars. And there were differing opinions amongst the people in the room, but it was a very nuanced, thoughtful discussion in which these men were engaged in a way that you just don't see that in classrooms as much anymore, because we're distracted people. And it was really transformative. And there was one man in there. He walked up to me afterwards, and he told me he was 40 years old, which is 2 years older than me. And he is in for life without parole. He started his sentence when he was 25 years old. And he asked me, what do you feel about the life without parole system? And it's something I hadn't given a lot of thought to before. And he said, I took a deal with the state because I was afraid of the death penalty. And there's nothing scarier than when you know your life is on the line and the state can take it away. So I took a deal with the state, life without parole. He's like, but I'm in like the rest of my life. And he was a Georgia State graduate where I went to school. And he was also somebody that actually knew the victim, because it was a pretty high profile case in my hometown of Augusta, Georgia. And the victim was the sister of my sister's classmate, so by proxy. So I knew that case. And, you know, he knew that he never denied committing the crime. And it was a robbery gone wrong. And, you know, I thought about it. I think about him often because I think about just the capability that we all have as humans and the worst things that we can do, depending on our environment and the situations that we're put under. And I do believe that people, I do believe in second chances, and I do believe that our systems should rehabilitate. And I do believe that you commit, you know, a horrible crime at age 25, there ought to be some chance between then and the rest of your life in which you serve your time and you're able to go back into the real world. So those are the types of things that we haven't really been discussing legislatively as much. Yeah. We did sign a bipartisan bill led by a Republican to abolish the death penalty last session. I don't know where that's going to go, because after session, our federal government started resuming executions, and I heard a piece in which they said they would use Georgia as a model. So I don't know what it's going to look like in terms of how our state lawmakers are going to proceed with something like that.
But that's the challenge you have, that from your perspective, most people don't understand how legislation operates. And they don't understand that sometimes you just have to launch a bill out there that you know is going to make a statement. It may not get passed, but it at least can start a discussion that maybe the following year you can recraft, and maybe it'll take a third year.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of legislators think that way because they've seen it. They've seen that's how things happen.
Yeah.
But the general population thinks, oh, well, you do it this year and it's done. And if it doesn't pass, well, then we've lost everything.
Right.
But you got to remember,
it's a long game.
Yeah.
It's a very long game.
It is a long game.
I mean, even with, for instance, that temporary protective order bill that I believe has a chance of passing this legislative session, that's been a discussion that's been ongoing in the advocacy community for many, many, many years. And it's always like, when's the right time? How do we do this? So even when a bill is introduced, there's a lot of work that has gone on prior to that. And we do get some successes. They just look differently because as a member of the minority party, we just don't really have the opportunity to pass legislation. So a lot of times what it looks like is we do a lot of the legwork and then we hand it over to a willing Republican colleague who is invested in that issue for whatever reasons. And it requires, the surrendering of ego, which is very hard for politicians.
Most adults have trouble with that.
And it also requires understanding how to build a relationship across the aisle and which lawmakers care about the same issues. And so there's a lot of work that goes into it. There was a bill that we were able to pass this year around the shackling of pregnant women. There was a woman, Pamela Nguyen, who was pregnant, and they shackled her, and she fell and had a miscarriage. And her miscarriage happened in the dark by herself, and she was screaming for hours. And then when the guards came and turned the lights on, she was covered in blood. And so she went and brought this issue to one of our Democratic colleagues, Representative David Dreyer, and he said, I'll do whatever I can to help you with this bill. And he created a roundtable with all of the stakeholders, and Pamela took the lead on this bill. And, I sat in on one of the sessions where it was a really collaborative effort where we went line by line, and every person in the room had input on, well, that doesn't make sense, or what if we change this, or what if it looked like this? And ultimately, Chairman Sharon Cooper, who's a Republican in Marietta, carried the bill, and it passed. So will no longer be shackling pregnant women in Georgia. And
which is something I just don't think you're ever going to have to say.
Right. And in addition to that, we were also holding pregnant women in solitary while they were pregnant and postpartum. And we have put restrictions around that, so we can no longer do that. So that piece is also related to the solitary. Right. That's like the only restriction we have, right? So it's these, it's really, you just pour your time and your heart and your energy into an issue and figure out how you can get it done. And then you spend a lot of times fighting really bad bills because we have some really bad ideas in Georgia.
Well, I think we have bad ideas everywhere. Georgia's
true.
Not special, but it just feels like it because that's where you live. Well, so the other side of this legislation conundrum is, how much do you feel it impacts the General Assembly when people come to the Capitol? When you have gatherings, when you have folks knocking door to door or trying to create a large assembly. Do you think those really move the dial on some of the things?
I do. And, I come from the framework as somebody who did come down to the General Assembly when I was not elected, working on that bill to clear the backlog of rape kits. And what was incredibly effective about that was I had organized sexual assault survivors, and the media picked it up, and it became a really big story because who in their right mind would not want to test rape kits, right? And one very courageous woman who happened to live in this district at the time, Jessica Caldas, who's an artist. She has done a lot of work around sexual assault, and she is a survivor of rape. And when she heard about this bill, as a personal friend, she said, "What can I do to help?" And I said, "Well, what if we wrote an op-ed about it and submitted it to the AJC?" And so she wrote an op-ed about it, and it was the first time she had written about it publicly. And the AJC published it. And I said, what if we went to Rose Scott and asked her if you can be on a closer look? And Rose said, yeah, absolutely. So she went on a closer look and spoke about it publicly for the first time on air. And by the time those things happened, local media had picked it up. And we got to the Capitol one day, and 11 Alive was waiting to talk to her. And we had all these women who spent the entire day at the Capitol talking to every single Republican lawmaker on the Senate side to ask them to pass this bill. And it was a combination of the pressure of advocacy and media that ultimately pressured the Senate to pass it. And it was really one chairwoman who was unwilling to move on the bill. And she ended up agreeing to support it, but only under the conditions, I think, of like giving her some credit for it, right? And at that point, it was like, fine, take the credit. Right. We just want this to pass.
Yeah.
And it did. And that was kind of my first, it was my first taste of like, oh, this does matter and it does work and we need to do it. It's hard because on other issues, for that issue, for instance, there wasn't a lobbying arm that was opposed to it that might have some power and money, right? For other issues, it is harder because you have people who have been hired by corporations to lobby, and they have contributed to elected officials and built relationships. And so the lobbying arm is extremely powerful. Yeah. At the Capitol, we have two sides, and the corporate lobbyists are on one side, and the nonprofit lobbyists are on the other side. So I call them the lobbyists and the advocates, although they're all lobbyists. Yeah. And I'm always hanging out on the advocate side. And the advocate side, they're my people. I have great relationships with them. They're the people that I work with on legislation. But there's not a financial incentive on that side. Everything is based on a belief and commitment to civil rights, to reproductive rights, to human rights, to immigration rights. And so it's a lot harder because you're working with fewer resources. And so they don't have the same type of leverage that the corporate side has. And so, it's a system that benefits people who have wealth. And it's been built that way very specifically because it's protecting who is in power. And that's why system changes take so long. But that's also why it is really critical that the public engages. Right. Because if we don't, then those things will continue to happen. Yeah.
And that's where people need to realize that it can make a difference. The PR, the showing up, the being seen. Because if you're not hearing from anybody except for the lobbyist, why would you change your mind?
Yeah.
There's not a good impetus there.
That's true. And I will also say that lawmakers are very sensitive around just people in their districts who show up because we have to pay attention to what our constituents are telling us, right? And so I think it's important no matter what. And, we live in 89, the most Democratic district in the state of Georgia. But I hear from Republican constituents, and I always respond to them and tell them why. This is why I voted this way. This is why this. And I do think that there are issues that are not partisan. Right. And I do think that we gain a better understanding of people when we allow that conversation to be had. And it's hard, though. It is hard. I think that as citizens and as advocates, you have to come to the table
with the ability to talk to a lawmaker versus yell at one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I can understand the impetus to do that, but I think lawmakers are human and humans operate in a certain way. And they say, it's easier to catch flies with honey than vinegar.
Right.
So I do think that those are some of the challenges because with things like the when your reproductive rights are being taken away, of course you're angry and you're scared and it's hard to be calm, but it is also hard to change somebody's mind. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All the yelling in the world's not going to change anybody's mind at some point. So.
Right. Yeah.
Well, these are all challenging issues that could make for a better Georgia. So I appreciate you coming in and talking. If people want to learn more about Fair Fight or Fair Count, what's the best way for them to get engaged?
It's probably www.fairfight.org is my guess.
And then if they need any insight, they can just reach you down at the Capitol.
They can reach me at the Capitol. They can email me, come to the Capitol. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming in today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, that's it for another Good Gracious Show podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. You can obviously find all the other episodes online at goodgraciousshow.com, 130-something of them. Lots of musicians, artists, change makers, all with a great southern feel because the South is the best place in the world because we don't, if you're inland enough, we don't have the hurricanes, we don't get the wildfires, and we're not Tornado Alley. And, I'll take it at this point. So, you go have a wonderful day. Give somebody a hug. Be a good neighbor, and we'll talk to you real soon.